Imagine Russia invading a smaller NATO member, testing the alliance's unity, and forcing the U.S. to respond. These are not just far-fetched hypotheticals, but scenarios that reflect the simmering tensions and fragile relations between Russia and NATO. Despite a brief period of cooperation after the end of the Cold War, relations have now deteriorated to the point where many believe we are in a new Cold War. Join us as we explore this hypothetical conflict and see how current tensions could lead to all-out war and how thin the line between peace and conflict is. Border division between Russia and NATO countries. In early mid-2024, Russia's military, despite losses in Ukraine, is prepared to push further into NATO territory, targeting Lithuania and the Baltic states. Russia's anger stems from NATO's expansion, which violated a non-binding promise made after the Soviet Union's collapse. With limited response from NATO to Russia's border provocations, Moscow's military readiness has increased. Russia still has about 1,750 operational tanks and 1,200 aircraft, and its infantry has grown larger than in 2022. Despite losses, its production capabilities, along with alliances with China and Iran, ensure a steady influx of equipment. On the Lithuanian border, Russia prepares for an assault, using GPS jamming and missile barrages, including cheaper subsonic models and more advanced supersonic and hypersonic missiles. As Russia unleashes its air and missile strikes, Lithuania's limited defenses stand little chance, with NATO not providing immediate reinforcement. Lithuania's military, with only 6 active aircraft, mostly helicopters and transport planes, is no match for Russia's advanced jets. While their long-range radar stations detect incoming Russian forces, they cannot stop them. Russia's primary goals are to capture Lithuania's capital, Vilnius, and seize land between Belarus and Poland to slow NATO's land defenses. Secondary objectives include conquering all 3 Baltic states and gaining better access to the Baltic Sea. Lithuania's intelligence had anticipated this move, but NATO's prior dismissals of their pleas for help proved costly. The attack begins at a strategically timed hour, catching most NATO leaders asleep, except for the American President and Canadian Prime Minister. Intelligence operatives quickly alert NATO leaders worldwide. The British, French, and German leaders struggle to grasp the gravity, while their North American counterparts prepare for immediate retaliation under Article 5 of the NATO agreement, pulling 26 countries, including Lithuania, into the conflict. Could retaliation trigger nuclear war and global destruction? But legal obligations aside, is an aggressive retaliation a plausible response? Will it save lives? Or most crucially of all, will it risk triggering an all-out nuclear war, mutually assured destruction of all major powers, and millions of unnecessary casualties? The NATO response force, the NRF, and its 4,000 troops are primed and ready to respond. They've been training for this and know that NATO can quickly mobilize a further 300,000 soldiers, with millions more prepared to be called up. But it needs the go-ahead. It can't act without authorization from the top. And the NATO leaders have a dilemma. NATO was implemented to deter Soviet expansion and aggression, seeking to prevent conflict. Now that war has started anyway, they face an unprecedented situation. How should they respond? Hour 2. NATO negotiators immediately try to open communication channels with the Kremlin. They're deeply concerned about the risk of worldwide nuclear war and outright destruction. But nobody answers. And because nobody answers, NATO leaders are at a loss for what to do. In fact, in Russia, Putin and his generals are purposefully ignoring the ringing red hotline, waiting to see how the West will respond. What move will they make? As dawn breaks, strange disruptions occur across Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Power substations malfunction, bank networks go offline, and port gates freeze. Government officials and contractors receive odd messages, and most computers display black screens with a Bitcoin ransom note. Although it initially appears to be an extortionist attack, the timing suggests Russia's elite hackers, particularly the GRU's Sandworm group, are responsible. Lithuanians wake up to a war and find their heating and air conditioning systems offline. Power outages persist, affecting streetlights, electric cars, and shops. More dangerously, software crucial for military operations is wiped out. Despite this, Lithuanian forces use WhatsApp via satellite Wi-Fi and runners to communicate. By the third hour of Russia's assault, Lithuanian forces fiercely resisted, defeating Russian troops at a 5-1 ratio, but ultimately were forced to retreat due to a lack of NATO support. NATO leaders, led by President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, begin formulating a response while managing the growing crisis. The looming threat of escalation is compounded by Russia's vast nuclear arsenal of 5580 warheads, including 1710 ready for launch, dwarfing the U.S. arsenal of 3708 and those of smaller nuclear powers like China, the UK, and France. In the fourth hour, Lithuania faces a Russian cyber attack targeting critical infrastructure. NATO experts swiftly counteract the malware, restoring power and communications, and allowing Lithuanian forces to adopt guerrilla tactics. This slows the Russian advance and inflicts heavy casualties, demoralizing their troops. NATO leaders finalize plans to reinforce Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia with overwhelming military support, including troops, tanks, aircraft, and missile systems. NATO mobilizes standing armies and volunteers, with European navies awaiting reinforcements and the U.S. fleet en route. Simultaneously, diplomatic channels are opened with Russia, delivering a stern message: nuclear weapons are not an option. NATO's combined strength and determination prepare it to respond decisively to the escalating conflict. Will NATO reach Lithuanians in time? The USS Ronald Reagan, a nuclear-powered Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, is already in the region despite its usual Indo-Pacific deployment. With FA-18 Super Hornets and E-2 Hawkeyes on board, NATO can respond quickly. The key question remains: will they reach Lithuania in time? By day 2, fierce fighting continues, but the front lines near Vilnius hold steady despite Russian advances. Lithuanian, NATO, and Russian special forces conduct surprise attacks, but the battle remains intense. NATO is en route, but can't stop the Russian onslaught, though Lithuanian forces continue to resist. Although Lithuania struggles, they manage to restore power systems and morale improves. The Russian assault on Vilnius is relentless, flattening buildings and causing civilian casualties, while artillery and missile attacks devastate critical infrastructure. NATO imposes more sanctions on Russia, which strains its economy, but trade with China, Iran, Belarus, and North Korea helps sustain Russia's war effort. By evening, hope arrives with the arrival of fifth-generation jets and missile launchers in Poland and Lithuania, significantly improving defenses. Day 3 sees the Baltic Sea as a critical route for reinforcements, with NATO's control of Scandinavia providing access to Lithuania and its seaports. Russia's Baltic Sea fleet is largely obsolete, consisting of just one old Soviet submarine, Dimitrov, and a few other outdated vessels like 27 corvettes and 2 frigates. Its primary focus is on intelligence and troop movement, rather than military power. The only destroyer, Sovremena-class Nostoyshevi, has been in repair since 2019. The Baltic Fleet is overshadowed by Russia's other priorities, such as the Black Sea Fleet and Northern Fleet in the Arctic. By the third day of the war, NATO engages Russian forces, overwhelming naval bases in Kaliningrad with superior numbers and firepower. NATO's missile systems intercept nearly all Russian missiles, while NATO jets and ground forces relentlessly attack Russian positions, supported by advanced Patriot missile defenses. Russia, with limited missile and jet supplies, faces significant challenges, and its air defense systems struggle to cope. As NATO's superior numbers and technology dominate, F-35Cs and Eurofighter Typhoons lead the assault. NATO forces establish strongholds in Poland, Estonia, and Latvia, with naval bases in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark providing constant resupply. Russian forces are trapped, with limited options left other than to surrender or continue futile counterattacks on harbors and logistics chains. Russia's only advantage remains its expertise in cyber attacks. Russian hackers launched a wave of cyber attacks on Scandinavian-owned NATO ports, initially causing chaos by disrupting schedules and cargo systems. Ships were delayed, leaving NATO vessels vulnerable to Russian missile and naval strikes, which managed to damage a few ships. However, NATO's hastily assembled escort warships forced the Russian fleet to retreat. Within hours, NATO cybersecurity teams restored port systems, and dock workers cleared the backlog in a couple of days, minimizing the impact of the attacks. As the conflict dragged on, Russia faced increasing setbacks. By the second month, Russian forces consolidated and retreated across the border, acknowledging the futility of further advances. However, intelligence reports of nuclear weapons being prepared in Kaliningrad and South Belarus alarmed NATO leaders, prompting swift preparations for a potential nuclear response with Tomahawk missiles. Despite Russia's remaining missile stockpile, the invasion of Lithuania appeared more symbolic than strategic. It was unlikely to succeed and never intended as a declaration of war against NATO, highlighting the high stakes and calculated risks of the operation. Would the U.S. intervene? It was always going to end up as a test, a sort of tragic live-fire exercise, a test of Russia's capabilities, an examination of how NATO would respond. Would nuclear weapons be on the table? Would the states get involved? Or would it refuse to risk escalating the conflict further? Russia hasn't gained any military ground or established any footholds. It will soon inevitably be forced to retreat, and yet that's what Putin and his leaders always expected would happen. They're fascinated by how the events have played out. NATO countries were far more willing to reinforce Lithuania than many in the war cabinet had imagined. Equally, the initial response from NATO was fraught with confusion, hesitation, and a hint of panic. Even as NATO missiles pound down, decimating their forces, Russia feels a gleam of satisfaction. It's learned a lot. It didn't take long for the surrender and peace agreement to be reached, in which Russia promised never to invade again and pay for the damages sustained to Lithuania and the NATO forces. Putin and his government smile. They lost the battle, decidedly. As the dust settles on this intense conflict, the real battle has only just begun, one fought not with missiles or jets, but with the lessons learned on both sides. NATO may have won the day, but the strategic implications of Russia's maneuvers will echo for years to come. What do you think? Was this all just a test, or did Russia have larger ambitions? Could nuclear weapons have turned the tide, or was this confrontation always destined for diplomacy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to check out our next video exploring the potential for an all-out war.